The courthouse steps were cold beneath Ellen Carter's worn boots as she clutched the crumpled foreclosure notice in her trembling hands. 28 years old, with calloused fingers and sun-weathered skin that told the story of every sunrise she'd spent working her family's ranch. Behind her, 3 generations of dreams sat silent under the gray Montana sky. The Carter Ranch, where her grandfather had built every fence post and her father had branded every calf until gambling fever took him 6 months ago. 24 hours, the banker had said with a cold smile that never reached his pale blue eyes. Pay the $15,000 or lose everything. The words echoed in her mind like the sound of nails being hammered into a coffin. $15,000. It might as well have been $15 million. She had $200 to her name and a dozen cattle that wouldn't bring half of what she needed, even if she could find a buyer by tomorrow. The crowd had gathered outside Millfield Bank like vultures circling roadkill. Their whispers cut through the November air sharper than the wind that howled down from the mountains. Foolish girl, thinking she could run a ranch alone after her daddy died. Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the farthest, dripping with the kind of satisfaction that only comes from watching someone else's misfortune. Should have married Thomas Whitman when she had the chance. Now look at her. 24 hours to lose it all to her dead father's gambling debts, added George Miller, the feed store owner who'd been extending her credit for months, knowing this day would come. His wife nodded beside him, clutching her handbag like Ellen might try to steal it. Always was too proud for her own good. Pride don't pay bills. Ellen felt every whispered word like needles piercing her ribs. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts that created small clouds in the cold air. Her heart hammered against her chest, so hard she was sure the whole town could hear it. But she kept her chin raised and her eyes forward, just like her mother had taught her before the fever took her 10 years back. If you keep your head high, Ellen, her mother had whispered from her deathbed, they might remember you're somebody worth respecting. But Ellen didn't see the figure watching from across the dusty street. Jackson Steele stood in the shadow of the general store's awning, his weathered Stetson pulled low over steel-gray eyes that had seen more than their share of hardship. At 35, he was the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, owner of the sprawling steel ranch that stretched from the valley floor to the mountain peaks. His black coat was buttoned tight against the cold, and his gloved hand rested against the inside pocket where a folded document waited. The deed to the Carter Ranch that he'd secretly purchased at the bank's private auction that very morning. Jackson had watched Ellen Carter struggle for months, seen her working from dawn to dusk, trying to keep her father's legacy alive. He'd watched her mend fences in the rain, birth calves in the snow, and hold her head high even when the whole town whispered behind her back. There was something about her stubborn determination that reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago. His late wife, Emma, had possessed that same fierce pride, that same refusal to break no matter how hard the world pushed. 24 hours, he whispered to himself, his breath forming a white cloud in the cold air. The words carried a weight that only he understood. What he was about to do would either save her or destroy them both. But watching her stand alone against the cruel whispers of the town, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not when he had the power to change everything. Inside the bank, the auction had been swift and brutal. 3 bidders, Thomas Whitman, who'd wanted the land to expand his own holdings and finally force Ellen to marry him. A railroad company looking to run tracks through the valley. And Jackson himself, who'd bid against them all with the kind of quiet determination that had built his fortune. When the gavel fell, Jackson had paid cash, $15,000 that felt like pocket change compared to what the land was really worth. The bank president had been surprised, but pleased. Didn't expect to see you here today, Mr. Steele. Though I suppose good land is always a sound investment. Jackson had simply nodded, signed the papers, and walked out without explaining himself to anyone. He never did explain himself. Actions spoke louder than words in his experience. And tomorrow Ellen Carter would learn exactly what his actions meant. Now, watching her face the crowd's mockery with the same dignity she'd shown at her father's funeral. Jackson touched the deed one more time. She thought she was losing everything. She had no idea that in less than 24 hours, her entire life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. Ellen turned away from the crowd's cruel laughter and began the long walk back to the ranch. Each step felt heavier than the last, her boots crunching through the frost-covered dust. Tomorrow, strangers would own the land her family had bled and sweated for. Tomorrow, she'd have nowhere to go and no way to support herself. The thought made her stomach clench with a fear so deep it threatened to bring her to her knees. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not here, not in front of the whole town. She'd save her tears for the privacy of her father's empty house, where she could grieve for everything she was about to lose. As she reached the edge of town, Ellen Carter had no idea that her salvation was already walking 3 steps behind her, close enough to catch her if she fell, but far enough away to let her keep her pride. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of old blood. Tomorrow would bring a new dawn, and with it, a meeting that would change both their lives forever. Jackson Steele had a proposition that would shock the whole county. The only question was whether Ellen Carter would be brave enough to accept it. The sun hadn't yet painted the sky pink when Ellen Carter made her way up the rocky ridge that overlooked both her family's ranch and the vast Steele property beyond. She'd barely slept, tossing and turning in her father's old bed, wondering what cruel game Jackson Steele was playing. Rich men didn't buy land just to be kind. There was always a price, always a catch, and she'd learned the hard way that powerful men collected their debts in ways that had nothing to do with money. Her boots slipped on the frost-covered rocks as she climbed, her breath coming in white puffs in the cold mountain air. Below her, the Carter Ranch looked smaller than ever, the weathered barn and modest house dwarfed by the sprawling steel operation that stretched to the horizon. Jackson's cattle dotted the landscape like black specks on a green canvas, thousands of head worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Heavy boots on stone, steady and sure like the man himself. Jackson Steele emerged from behind a boulder, his dark coat buttoned against the morning chill, his gray eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He looked like he'd been awake for hours, clean-shaven and alert, while she felt like something the cat dragged in after a sleepless night. "You came," he said simply, his voice carrying that low rumble she'd heard yesterday at the auction. There was no triumph in his tone, no mockery, just a statement of fact. "You said to meet you at sunrise," Ellen replied, crossing her arms over her chest. The gesture was meant to look defiant, but mostly she was trying to stop her hands from shaking. "So here I am. Now tell me what you want from me before you throw me off my own land." Jackson studied her face for a long moment, those steel-gray eyes taking in every detail. She lifted her chin higher, refusing to look away even though her heart was pounding like a trapped bird in her chest. Finally, he spoke, and his words hit her like a bolt of lightning. "I'm not throwing you off your land, Ellen. I'm offering you a chance to earn it back." She blinked at him, certain she'd heard wrong. "What did you say?" "You heard me." Jackson pulled the deed from his coat pocket, unfolding the legal document that represented everything she'd ever cared about. "This paper says I own the Carter Ranch now. Lock, stock, and barrel. But I didn't buy it to keep it." Ellen's mind reeled. "Then why? Why would you spend $15,000 on land you don't want?" Jackson was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost vulnerable. "Because I watched what those vultures in town were planning to do to it. Thomas Whitman wanted to buy it cheap and force you into marriage. The railroad company was going to tear down your family's house and run tracks right through your father's grave. I couldn't let that happen. So you decided to play God instead." The words came out sharper than she intended, fueled by months of frustration and fear. "No," Jackson said calmly. "I decided to offer you a choice. Work for me for 1 year. Manage my ranch operations. Prove you're as good as I think you are, and at the end of 12 months, I'll sign this deed back over to you. Free and clear. Ellen stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. It sounded too good to be true, and in her experience, things that sounded too good to be true usually were. "What's the real price?" she asked quietly. "What do you really want from me?" Jackson's jaw tightened slightly. "I want you to turn my ranch into something more than just a business. I've got money, I've got land, I've got cattle. What I don't have is someone who understands that a ranch should be a home, not just an investment. My foreman runs things like a factory. My hands show up, do their jobs, and go home. There's no heart in it. And you think I can give you heart?" Ellen couldn't keep the bitterness out of her voice. The woman the whole town calls a failure. The woman who spent 3 days straight in a blizzard last winter making sure every one of her cattle survived, Jackson countered. The woman who delivered Mrs. Patterson's baby when the doctor couldn't make it through the storm. The woman who's been keeping that ranch running on determination and prayer for 6 months after her father died. His voice grew fiercer with each word. "The town can call you whatever they want. I know what I see." Ellen felt something dangerous stirring in her chest. Hope. She tried to push it down, but it was like trying to hold back a spring flood. "1 year," she repeated slowly. "1 year. You succeed. The ranch is yours again. You fail." He shrugged. "Well, you're no worse off than you are right now. And if I refuse your offer?" Jackson folded the deed and tucked it back into his coat. "Then you pack your things and find somewhere else to go. I won't force you off the land, but I can't give you what you haven't earned either." The wind picked up, cutting through her thin jacket like a knife. Ellen looked down at the two ranches spread out below them, the morning sun just beginning to touch the valley floor. Her father's dream dying slowly in the shadow of Jackson's empire. It wasn't really a choice at all. "When do I start?" she asked. For the first time since she'd known him, Jackson Steele smiled. It transformed his entire face, taking years off his weathered features and revealing the man he might have been before life hardened him. "Right now, if you're ready, I'll have your things moved to the foreman's cabin by tonight." "I can find my own place to live," Ellen said quickly. "The foreman's cabin comes with the job. It's part of the deal." Jackson's tone brooked no argument. "Besides, you'll need to be close to the operation if you're going to turn around." As they made their way down the ridge together, Ellen's mind was already racing with possibilities. She'd grown up on a working ranch, learned everything from her father before gambling fever took his common sense. She knew cattle, knew land, knew what it took to make a place prosper. The question was whether Jackson Steele would really give her the freedom to implement her ideas, or if this was just another way for a rich man to control a woman who had nowhere else to turn. "One more thing," Jackson said as they reached the bottom of the hill. "My foreman, Buck Morrison, has been with me for 5 years. He's not going to like taking orders from a woman, especially one the town considers a failure. You'll have to prove yourself to him before you can prove yourself to me." Ellen stopped walking and turned to face him. "Mr. Steele, I've been taking care of myself since I was 18 years old. I've faced down bulls, blizzards, and bank presidents. I think I can handle one stubborn cowboy." Jackson's smile widened. "I'm counting on it, Miss Carter. I'm counting on it." As they walked toward the Steele Ranch headquarters, Ellen felt the first flutter of something she hadn't experienced in months: possibility. She had 365 days to prove she was more than the town's pity case. 365 days to earn back everything she'd lost. It was the chance of a lifetime, even if it came wrapped in more complications than she could possibly imagine. What she didn't know yet was that Buck Morrison had already made up his mind about the new boss lady, and his opinion wasn't going to make her life any easier. Buck Morrison was exactly what Ellen had expected and worse. 52 years old with tobacco-stained teeth and hands like leather. He stood in front of the Steele Ranch headquarters with his arms crossed and a sneer that could sour milk. The other ranch hands gathered behind him like soldiers waiting for orders, their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. Ellen had been on the job exactly 1 hour, and already she could feel the resistance as thick as morning fog. "So you're the new boss lady," Buck drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice dangerously close to Ellen's worn boots. "Heard you couldn't even keep your own place running. Now you're going to tell us how to run ours." Ellen felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm here to manage operations, just like Mr. Steele asked. We could do this the easy way or the hard way, Buck. Your choice." Buck laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "Easy way? Little lady, there ain't nothing easy about running cattle. Maybe you should stick to cooking and cleaning. Leave the ranch work to men who know what they're doing." Before Ellen could respond, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main pasture. One of the younger hands came running, his face pale with panic. "Buck, boss lady, we got trouble in the north pasture. The cattle are sick, real sick. 3 of them are already down, and more keep falling." Ellen's blood ran cold. Cattle disease could wipe out an entire herd in days, bankrupting even a ranch as wealthy as Jackson's. This was her first real test, and if she failed, her year of proving herself would be over before it really began. Buck was already striding toward the pasture, shouting orders at the other hands. "Get the horses saddled. Send someone for the vet. Move it." He glanced back at Ellen with obvious satisfaction. "Welcome to ranch life, boss lady. Hope you got a strong stomach." Ellen ignored his taunt and followed, her mind racing through everything her father had taught her about cattle diseases. By the time they reached the north pasture, she could see the scope of the problem. At least a dozen cattle were showing symptoms, stumbling, foaming at the mouth, their eyes rolled back in distress. 3 lay motionless on the ground. "Vet won't be here for 2 hours, one of the hands reported. Says he's dealing with an emergency over at the Henley Ranch." Buck cursed colorfully. 2 hours might as well be 2 days. "We're going to lose the whole herd at this rate." He turned to Ellen with a mixture of challenge and desperation. "Well, boss lady, what's your expert opinion?" Ellen knelt beside one of the fallen cattle, examining its symptoms carefully. The foam around the mouth, the dilated pupils, the way the animal's legs were rigid. She'd seen this before. "It's not disease," she said quietly, then louder so everyone could hear. "It's poison." Buck scoffed. "Poison? Lady, you've been reading too many dime novels." But Ellen was already moving, following her instincts and her father's voice in her memory. She walked to the edge of the pasture where wild larkspur grew in purple clusters. Beautiful but deadly to cattle, especially when they grazed during dry spells when other forage was scarce. "There," she pointed. "Larkspur. The cattle have been eating it because the regular grass is thin this year." "That's just wildflowers," Buck protested, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. Ellen didn't waste time arguing. She grabbed a rope from the nearest horse and began fashioning a crude harness. "We need to get the affected cattle away from this area immediately, and we need to make them vomit up what they've eaten." She looked around at the skeptical faces. "I need salt, lots of it, and warm water. Someone ride to the ranch house and get every container of salt Mrs. Henderson has in the kitchen." "You can't be serious," Buck said. "Making cattle vomit? That's the craziest thing I ever heard. My father used this method to save our herd 5 years ago." Ellen shot back. "Would you rather listen to me or watch Mr. Steele's cattle die while we wait for a vet who might not know what to do anyway?" For a moment, Buck just stared at her. Then one of the younger hands, a boy named Jimmy who couldn't be more than 18, stepped forward. "I'll get the salt, miss. My horse is the fastest." "Good man, Jimmy." Ellen was already moving to the nearest sick animal, her hands gentle but firm as she examined its condition. "The rest of you, help me separate the healthy cattle from the sick ones. Move them to the south pasture, away from the larkspur." What followed was 2 hours of the hardest work Ellen had ever done. With salt water and careful technique, she managed to induce vomiting in 6 of the affected cattle, purging the poison from their systems. 3 were too far gone to save, but 9 animals that would have died were back on their feet by evening, weak but alive. Buck watched the whole process in stunned silence. When a vet finally arrived, he confirmed Ellen's diagnosis and treatment. Larkspur poisoning, just like the lady said. And this salt water treatment? Haven't seen that done in years, but it's the right call. Probably saved you $10,000 in losses. As the sun set over the mountain peaks, Ellen found herself sitting on the porch of the foreman's cabin, her clothes filthy, her hands shaking from exhaustion and leftover adrenaline. She'd proven she could handle a crisis, but the real test would be whether the man would respect her judgment going forward. Buck Morrison appeared on her porch like a ghost, his hat in his hands for the first time since she'd met him. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, and Mr. Steele owes you a debt. What you did today, that was real ranching, the kind that saves lives and livelihoods." Ellen looked up at him, too tired to feel triumphant. "Does this mean you'll stop fighting me on every decision?" Buck's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. "I'll stop fighting you on the smart decisions, but I reserve the right to speak up when I think you're wrong." "Fair enough," Ellen said. "That's all I can ask for." As Buck walked away, Ellen heard footsteps on the gravel drive. Jackson Steele emerged from the darkness, his face tight with worry. "I heard about the cattle. Are you all right?" "I'm fine. We lost 3 head but saved 9. Could have been much worse." Jackson sat down on the porch step beside her, close enough that she could smell the soap he'd used and the leather of his jacket. "Buck told me what you did. Said you diagnosed and treated the poisoning better than most veterinarians could have." Ellen felt a flush of pride, quickly followed by embarrassment. "My father taught me. He always said a rancher who can't doctor his own animals won't stay in business long." "Your father was a wise man." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "The whole town's going to hear about this by tomorrow. Word travels fast when someone does something impressive, or when someone does something stupid," Ellen added dryly. Jackson chuckled, a sound that did strange things to her pulse. "Nothing stupid about saving my cattle and earning the respect of the most stubborn foreman in Montana." He stood up, brushing dust from his pants. "Get some rest, Ellen. Tomorrow we'll start working on the long-term improvements this place needs." As he walked away, Ellen realized something had changed. For the first time since her father died, she felt like she belonged somewhere. It wasn't her land yet, might never be her land, but it was a place where her skills mattered, where her knowledge had value. The town might still whisper about her failures, but on the Steele Ranch, she was earning something more precious than their approval. She was earning respect, one crisis at a time. And deep in her heart, she was starting to suspect she was earning something else too. Feelings for Jackson Steele that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way he looked at her like she was worth something special. But that was a dangerous thought for another day. Tonight, she just wanted to savor the feeling of a job well done and the knowledge that she'd proven herself when it mattered most. 3 weeks had passed since the cattle poisoning incident, and Ellen was finally starting to feel like she belonged at the Steele Ranch. The hands tipped their hats when they saw her. Buck actually listened to her suggestions, and Jackson had taken to stopping by her cabin in the evenings to discuss the day's operations. Those conversations had grown longer and more personal with each passing night, filled with shared stories of loss, dreams, and the kind of comfortable silences that made her heart race. But on this particular morning, as Ellen made her way to the main barn, she felt like the world was crumbling beneath her feet. She'd been coming back from checking the fence line when she heard voices drifting from Jackson's office window. Jackson's voice and that of Mr. Hartwell from the Cattleman's Bank. "1 year, then I'll have everything I need from her," Jackson had been saying, his tone businesslike and cold. "Once she's improved the operations and increased the herd's value, I can sell at a much higher profit. The Carter woman is saving me thousands in consulting fees." Ellen had frozen in place, her heart hammering so hard she could barely hear Hartwell's reply. "Clever thinking, Steele. Use her expertise to improve your holdings, then cut her loose when you're done. The bank appreciates men who think strategically about their investments." She'd stumbled away from the window, Jackson's words echoing in her mind like a death sentence. Everything I need from her. So that's what this was about. Not redemption, not second chances, just cold business calculation. He was using her knowledge to increase his ranch's value, probably planning to sell both properties once she'd done all the hard work. Ellen spent the rest of that day going through the motions, checking cattle, mending fences, reviewing feed orders, all while feeling like she was drowning in plain sight. The worst part wasn't even Jackson's betrayal. It was how stupid she'd been to believe that a man like him could actually care about a woman like her. That's when the sabotage began. It started small. A bridle strap cut just enough to break under pressure. Feed mysteriously contaminated with dirt and debris. Tools going missing from a barn. Ellen figured it was just bad luck at first, the kind of minor disasters that plagued every ranch operation. But when she found the main water line to the cattle troughs had been deliberately cut, she knew someone was trying to make her fail. She spent 3 hours in the mud that morning, fixing the water line by herself rather than calling for help. Her hands were raw and bleeding by the time she finished, her clothes soaked through with freezing water. But she got the job done, just like she always did. She wouldn't give Jackson the satisfaction of seeing her fail, not when he was probably counting on it. The next week brought more problems. Someone had mixed sand into the feed bins, making the grain ineatable. The latch on the bullpen had been tampered with, nearly letting Thunder, Jackson's prize bull, into the mare's pasture where he could have caused serious damage. Each incident was small enough to explain away, but together they painted a clear picture of deliberate sabotage. Ellen began working longer hours, checking and double-checking everything, sleeping with one ear open for sound of trouble. She was exhausted, running on coffee and stubbornness, but she refused to complain or ask for help. If Jackson was planning to use her and discard her, she'd at least make sure he got his money's worth of improvements before she left. It was Buck who finally caught the saboteur. Ellen was working late one evening, trying to fix a broken fence post that had mysteriously snapped during the night, when Buck appeared out of the darkness like an avenging angel. In his grip was Tommy Fletcher, one of the newer hands, his face pale with guilt and fear. Caught him red-handed pouring kerosene on the hay bales, Buck announced grimly, "Boy's been taking money to make you look bad, Miss Carter." Ellen stared at Tommy, a kid barely old enough to shave who'd seemed eager to please since his first day. "Who's paying you?" she asked quietly. Tommy squirmed in Buck's grip. "I can't tell you that, miss. He said he'd run me out of the territory if I talked." "Son," Buck's voice carried the weight of years and authority, "you're already in more trouble than you can handle. Start talking, or I'll let Mr. Steele deal with you personally." The threat worked. Tommy's resolve crumbled like a sand castle in the rain. "Thomas Whitman," he whispered, "he's been paying me $20 a month to make sure things went wrong around here. Said if the lady failed, he'd buy the ranch cheap and give me a permanent job." Ellen felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas Whitman, her former suitor who'd made her life miserable after she rejected his marriage proposal. Of course he'd be behind this. He'd never forgiven her for choosing independence over his offers of financial security and social respectability. Buck shook Tommy like a rag doll. "You fool boy. You nearly killed prize cattle with your sabotage. Mr. Steele could have you arrested for destruction of property. Please don't tell him," Tommy begged, tears streaming down his young face. "I needed the money for my sick mother." Mr. Whitman said it was just harmless pranks to teach the lady a lesson. Ellen looked at the boy, really looked at him. He was probably 17, skinny as a rail, with the desperate look of someone who'd never had enough money to feel secure. She'd seen that look in her own mirror often enough. "Buck, let him go. Miss Carter, this boy could have ruined everything you've worked for." But he didn't. Ellen stepped closer to Tommy, her voice gentle but firm. "You're going to pack your things tonight and leave the territory, understand? And if I ever catch you on Steele property again, I won't be so forgiving." Tommy nodded frantically and disappeared into the darkness as soon as Buck released him. The older man shook his head in disgust. You're too soft-hearted for your own good, Miss Carter. That boy could have gotten you killed. Maybe, but ruining his life won't undo the damage. Ellen rubbed her tired eyes. Besides, now we know who the real enemy is. Buck studied her face in the moonlight. This ain't just about ranch management anymore, is it? Whitman's got personal reasons for wanting you to fail. Ellen almost laughed at the understatement. Thomas Whitman asked me to marry him 3 times. When I turned him down the last time, he told the whole town I was too proud for my own good and would end up dying alone and poor. Guess he's trying to make sure his prediction comes true. Well, he's picked the wrong woman to tangle with, Buck said fiercely. You've got more backbone than half the men in this territory. As Buck walked away, Ellen stood alone in the darkness, feeling more isolated than ever. She'd solved the sabotage problem, but the bigger betrayal still weighed on her heart. Jackson was using her, Thomas was trying to destroy her, and she was caught between them like a rabbit between 2 wolves. She walked slowly back to her cabin, every step feeling heavier than the last. Tomorrow she'd have to face Jackson, pretend she didn't know about his conversation with the banker, continue working to improve a ranch he'd probably sell the moment her year was up. The thought made her stomach twist with a combination of hurt and rage. But as she reached her door, she saw a light still burning in Jackson's office window. He was working late again, probably calculating how much money her improvements were adding to his property value. Ellen stood there for a long moment, watching his silhouette move behind the curtains, wondering if anything between them had been real or if it was all just part of his business strategy. One thing was certain. She couldn't keep working for a man she was falling in love with who saw her as nothing more than a useful tool. Something had to change, and soon. But what she didn't know was that Jackson had seen Tommy Fletcher running from the ranch, had heard enough of Buck's conversation to understand what had been happening. And he was about to have a very serious conversation with Thomas Whitman that would change everything between them forever. Ellen barely had time to wash the mud from her hands the next morning before the storm hit. Not the weather kind, but the kind that came in the form of Thomas Whitman's polished carriage rolling up to the Steel Ranch headquarters with Sheriff Morrison and a man in an expensive suit trailing behind. She watched from her cabin window as Thomas stepped down from his carriage, looking every inch the prosperous rancher in his tailored coat and shiny boots. Behind him, the stranger carried a leather briefcase that probably contained enough legal papers to bury her dreams 6 feet deep. Ellen's stomach clenched with dread. Tommy Fletcher must have run straight to his employer after Buck caught him, and now Thomas was making his final move. Jackson emerged from the main house, his face thunderous as he took in the unwelcome visitors. Even from a distance, Ellen could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested near the gun at his hip. Whatever Thomas was planning, Jackson sensed trouble coming. Stay in the cabin, Ellen whispered to herself, but her feet had other ideas. She found herself walking toward the confrontation, drawn by the same stubborn pride that had gotten her in trouble her whole life. If they were going to destroy her, she'd face it standing up. Jackson, Thomas called out with false friendliness. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Perfect day to clear up some legal misunderstandings. What do you want, Whitman? Jackson's voice could have frozen water in July. Thomas smiled, the expression sharp as a blade. I want to discuss the illegal arrangement you have with Miss Carter. Sheriff Morrison here has some concerns about the validity of your employment contract. The sheriff, a weak-chinned man who'd always done whatever the town's wealthy men told him to do, stepped forward nervously. Mr. Steele, there's been complaints filed about Miss Carter trespassing on private property and conducting fraudulent business practices. What fraudulent practices? Jackson's voice was deadly quiet. The man in the expensive suit opened his briefcase with a theatrical flourish. I'm Attorney Harold Finch from Helena. My client, Mr. Whitman, has evidence that Miss Carter entered into your employment under false pretenses, misrepresenting her qualifications and experience. Furthermore, the original sale of the Carter Ranch was conducted under duress, making any subsequent agreements potentially invalid. Ellen felt the world spinning around her. False pretenses? She'd never lied about anything. And the sale was legal. The bank had made sure of that before they'd taken everything she owned. That's a lie, she said loudly, stepping into the circle of men. I never misrepresented anything to Mr. Steele. Thomas turned to her with mock sympathy. Oh, Ellen. Dear, deluded Ellen. Did you really think Jackson didn't know about your father's other debts? The gambling losses in Denver? The cattle you sold that didn't belong to you? What cattle? Ellen's voice cracked. I never sold cattle that didn't belong to me. The 15 head you sold to cover your father's medical bills. Thomas continued smoothly. Cattle that were already pledged as collateral to the cattleman's bank. That's theft, Ellen. And theft makes any contract you've signed worthless. Ellen's blood ran cold. She had sold cattle to pay for her father's doctor bills, but they'd been their own cattle, free and clear. Or so she'd thought. I have the bills of sale. Everything was legal. Attorney Finch pulled out a stack of papers. These documents show that your father used his entire herd as collateral for multiple loans. You had no legal right to sell any animals without bank approval. Jackson stepped forward, his face like granite. And I suppose you just happened to discover these irregularities now, months after the sale? Thomas's smile widened. I've been conducting a thorough investigation into Miss Carter's business practices ever since I heard about her association with you. The town deserves to know what kind of woman has been given authority over such valuable property. The town, Jackson repeated slowly, or just you. Before Thomas could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the tense standoff. A dozen riders appeared over the ridge, led by Buck Morrison and including most of the Steel Ranch hands. But behind them came an unexpected sight. Half the town of Millfield, including women Ellen had never seen leave their kitchens and shopkeepers who'd never missed a day of business. Mrs. Henderson climbed down from her wagon with surprising agility for a woman her age. Sheriff Morrison, she called out in her commanding voice, I hope you're not here to arrest Miss Carter without hearing from the people who've actually worked with her. The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Now, Mrs. Henderson, this is official business, official nonsense, interrupted Doc Peterson, who'd ridden out despite his arthritis. Ellen Carter doctored my horse when he had colic last month. Saved the animal's life with remedies I'd never seen before. If she's a fraud, she's the most knowledgeable fraud in Montana territory. One by one, other voices joined in. The blacksmith talked about how Ellen had helped shoe his horses when his apprentice was sick. The widow Morrison mentioned how Ellen had given her family beef during the hard winter without asking for payment. Even some of the men who'd laughed at her outside the bank stepped forward to defend her character. Thomas's face was turning red with frustration. These people don't understand the legal complexities. What we understand, Buck Morrison interrupted, is that Miss Carter has worked harder than any foreman this ranch has ever seen. And what we also understand is that you've been paying hands to sabotage her work. The sheriff perked up at this. Sabotage? That's a serious accusation. Tommy Fletcher confessed everything last night. Buck continued. $20 a month from Mr. Whitman to make sure Miss Carter failed. I've got witnesses. Attorney Finch tried to regain control. Even if there was sabotage, it doesn't change the fact that Miss Carter's original employment contract is invalid due to her fraudulent representation. What fraudulent representation? Jackson's voice cut through the lawyer's words like a knife. Ellen Carter told me exactly who she was and what she'd done. Every word was the truth. Thomas stepped closer to Jackson, his composure finally cracking. She's made fools of all of you. She's nothing but a failed rancher who couldn't even keep her father's legacy alive. The words hung in the air like a slap. Ellen felt every eye turn to her, waiting to see how she'd respond. For a moment, she was back outside the bank, feeling the weight of the town's judgment, the sting of their mockery. But then she looked around at the faces surrounding her, not all friendly, but many showing something she'd never expected to see: respect. You're right, she said quietly. her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. I did fail to keep my father's ranch. I failed to pay his debts. I failed to be the daughter he deserved. She took a deep breath. But I didn't fail to learn from those mistakes. I didn't fail to work harder than I ever worked before. And I didn't fail to prove that a woman can run a ranch as well as any man, given the chance. She turned to address the crowd directly. Thomas Whitman asked me to marry him 3 times. Each time, I told him I'd rather make my own way in the world than be dependent on a husband's charity. That's what this is really about. Not fraud, not legal technicalities. It's about a man who can't stand that a woman chose independence over his protection. Thomas's face was purple now. You self-righteous. That's enough. Jackson's voice cracked like a whip. Sheriff, if you want to investigate fraud, start with the man who's been bribing ranch hands to commit sabotage. As for these legal papers, my attorney can review them properly instead of having them sprung on us like an ambush. The sheriff looked around at the crowd, clearly calculating which side would be safer to support. Well, I suppose we could postpone any action until a proper investigation. There won't be any investigation, Jackson interrupted, because I'm not pressing charges against Ellen for anything. Her contract with me is valid, legal, and will continue until its completion. Thomas sputtered. You can't just ignore legal evidence. Watch me, Jackson said flatly. Then he turned to Ellen, his gray eyes intense. The question is, do you want to finish what we started? Because I meant what I said. 1 year, and the Carter Ranch is yours again. Ellen looked at him, searching his face for any sign of the calculating businessman she'd thought she'd overheard. Instead, she saw something that made her heart skip. The same respect she'd seen in Buck's eyes. The same determination she felt burning in her own chest. Around them, the crowd waited. Thomas and his lawyer stood in frustrated silence. The sheriff fidgeted with his badge, and Ellen Carter made the choice that would define the rest of her life. Yes, she said simply. I want to finish what we started. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Thomas stormed back to his carriage, shouting threats about legal action that everyone knew he'd never follow through on. And as the excitement died down and people began to drift back to town, Jackson stepped closer to Ellen. We need to talk, he said quietly. There are things I need to explain about that conversation you overheard. Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs. You knew I heard you? I knew someone was listening. And I knew if it was you, you get the wrong idea. His hand brushed against hers, sending shivers up her arm. Meet me at the ridge tonight after supper. It's time you knew the whole truth. As he walked away, Ellen realized that her year of proving herself was far from over. In fact, it was about to get a lot more complicated. The ridge looked different in the moonlight, softer somehow, as Ellen climbed the familiar path to where she'd first met Jackson at sunrise months ago. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it over the wind through the pines. Whatever Jackson was about to tell her would either heal the wound in her chest or tear it wider. He was waiting for her, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, his hat in his hands. You came, he said softly. You said you'd explain about the conversation I overheard. Ellen kept her distance, not trusting herself to get too close. About how you planned to get everything you needed from me and then sell a profit. Jackson nodded slowly. That conversation was real, but you didn't hear the whole thing. He stepped closer, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. What you missed was Hartwell asking me to sell both ranches to a railroad consortium. They want to run tracks through the valley. Ellen's breath caught. Both ranches? I told him no. Told him that after you'd improved my operations, I planned to deed the Carter Ranch back to you as promised. Then ask if you'd consider merging our properties as equal partners. Jackson's voice grew softer. Not business partners, Ellen. Life partners. The words hit her like lightning. You mean, I've been half in love with you since I watched you face down that crowd outside the bank with your chin up and your dignity intact. Jackson reached into his coat and pulled out 2 folded papers. This is the deed to your family's ranch, signed and ready. And this is a partnership agreement for the combined properties, with both our names as equal owners. Ellen stared at the documents, afraid to believe what she was seeing. Why? Why would you give up half your ranch? Because what good is having the biggest spread in Montana if you're spending it alone? Jackson set the papers aside and stepped closer, close enough that she could see the vulnerability in his gray eyes. Because you turned this place into a home again. Because watching you work, seeing your strength, your kindness to that Fletcher boy even after he betrayed you, it reminded me what it feels like to be alive. Jackson, Ellen's voice was barely a whisper. I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm older than you, set in my ways, probably too serious for my own good. But I love you, Ellen Carter. I love your stubborn pride and your gentle heart and the way you never back down from a fight. He dropped to one knee, pulling a simple gold ring from his pocket. Will you marry me? Not because you need saving, but because I need you to save me from spending the rest of my life alone. Ellen felt tears streaming down her face as she looked down at this proud, strong man kneeling in the dirt for her. Get up, she said shakily. Jackson's face fell. Ellen, get up so I can kiss you properly when I say yes. The smile that spread across Jackson's face was brighter than the moon overhead. He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as she laughed and cried at the same time. When he set her down, his kiss was gentle and fierce and full of promises for tomorrow. The town's going to have a lot to say about this, Ellen murmured against his lips. Let them talk. We've got more important things to do than worry about gossip. 6 months later, Ellen stood on the porch of their combined ranch house, watching the sun set over land that stretched farther than she could see, land that belonged to both of them equally, legally, and in their hearts. The wedding had been simple, held right there on the ridge where everything began, with half the county in attendance. Even some of the women who'd whispered cruelest about her dad had come, bringing wedding presents and apologies. Jackson came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Steele. Just thinking about how this all started, Ellen leaned back against his solid warmth. They mock me for being in debt. Call me a failure. But that debt led me to you. And you led me back to life, Jackson murmured, his hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. Best investment I ever made. As the stars came out over the valley, Ellen Carter Steele smiled. She'd thought debt would destroy her. Instead, it had brought her the greatest wealth of all, a love that saw her worth, land that was truly hers, and a future full of endless possibilities.